Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net. You joined us for chapter 7 of which I think is show 8 of the series we're doing through Hosea, however you want to go with your dialect. We're being led through this minor prophet by our Rabbi Joshua Neely, and he's going to help us unpack some of the stuff in this chapter.
Great, and I'm just going to remind everybody watching that when we say minor prophet, we're not talking about their importance or the veracity of their prophecy. We're simply talking about the quantity of material they left behind.
Sure. But you know, it's interesting because when I was looking up a timeline today for reasons that will become apparent later of when kind of the different prophets were doing their thing at different times, and this guy seemed to span kind of quite a large area of time compared to some of the other ones who didn't so much. Verse 1 of chapter 7. Oh, and I just want to remind people that they can go back and they can look at all the previous videos that's in the timeline, and we finished chapter 6 with the verses saying that Israel was defiled and that Judah also wasn't without blame, and that there would be a harvest coming. So, when I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim and the evils of Samaria are revealed, for they commit falsehood, and a thief comes, and a troop makes a raid without. Now I know that in the previous show we spoke about kind of almost marauding gangs of gangsters and bandits, and how that was a picture of the theft and the loss that was being perpetrated by the leaders of the communities and the priesthood at that point. And I know that we've also covered the fact that Ephraim is another word for Israel, but I'm confused about the use of Samaria in this text.
Oh, well, the term Shomron of Samaria is another one of the regions in the northern part of the kingdom, or rather in the northern kingdom of Israel.
Okay.
So it's a contrast to Judah, which is the southern half of that same central territory in the land of Israel.
Mm. So often then, it's literally just pulling out locations rather than specifically about a group of people, and it's just illustrating to the audience the difference between the two groups.
Right. I mean, for an American listener, you'll be like talking about the Rockies. Right. So the Rockies are a long mountain range in the western half of the country. They span multiple states, but if you say the Rockies, people have a pretty good idea of what part of the country you're talking about.
Sure. Okay.
But this is a great carryover verse from chapter 6. If you remember, chapter 6 began with the notion that maybe the northern kingdom would repent, maybe they would return as a last resort to God. And God was sort of going, I'm not sure about this. And chapter 7 is really driving that home, which is, every time I go to try and help you, to heal, to be, respond to your repentance, bam, you guys are just right back out there dealing treacherously, thieving and stealing and robbing and banditing and all of that. It's just, God is saying, I'm going to give this a few minutes to see whether your contrition is really going to stick.
It's actually, when I was reading through it, what I found was something I hadn't considered before, was the picture that's painted of these two groups of people. It's such a contrast of what you kind of expect from those people. So as a person that grew up in the church, and I left all that behind now, but when I read about Israel in in liturgy or even in the Torah, for the most part, it's this group of chosen people who are supposed to uphold the law and spread light into the world and be people to aspire to.
Right, you're on the money so far.
And then you get this, and you're like, how could they be so like, it's like polar opposites? It's stunning. Most people don't. I think if for people that don't really open their Bibles anywhere awkward, because often your Bible is there to help you when you feel bad by showing you something uplifting. And you don't often volunteer your time to look at the more nitty-gritty kind of uncomfortable parts.
Right.
But this is really, it shows a completely different group. The disparity is amazing.
Well, that is pretty much why the prophets are there. They came because the people were not living up to the covenant, and God wasn't trying to change the covenant. He was trying to get people to simply follow it. And the prophets were that voice on earth trying to say, people, this is not the way it's supposed to go. And unfortunately, not enough heard it early enough that we could have avoided the destruction of the Babylonian, the Assyrians for the north and then the Babylonians for the south.
So, in verse 2, they do not say in their heart that I remember all their evil. Now their deeds have surrounded them. They were before my face. Now, I'd like to know what you've got there, because even the comparison I have here is that they do not lay up in their heart that all of their evil is inscribed before me as a remembrance. So the way the verse reads to me is that they assume that the Creator can't see everything that they've done. They just don't worry about that. But that the Creator has, and that all those deeds have surrounded them. But I'm wondering if yours, because sometimes yours is a bit more eloquent and a bit more poetic, your version.
The translation that I'm reading uses the phrase, they do not consider that I remember all their wickedness. Their misdeeds have been all around them. They have ever been before me.
Oh, okay. Yes, they're slightly different.
Well, it's slightly different, but I mean, the basic idea, again, a good reminder of biblical poetry. When we talk about the lev, the heart, we're not just talking about emotion, we're talking about the full seat of consciousness. So it's both rational, emotional, everything that we try to cut up and divide, it was all one unit in biblical conception of how people were, which modern science is pretty much now confirming. It may not be located in the organ of the heart, but it definitely is a combined unit. But when we say they don't consider in their heart, they don't think in their heart, they do not say in their heart, that's what it's talking about, right? They say in their heart means they don't think. They're not considering. They're not they're not figuring out that, you know what, God actually keeps track of these things. And so when you say, "Oh, I'm sorry," God kind of knows whether you're really sorry, and God knows what you have done, and God knows what you're doing now, even after you've said you're sorry, and all of that. It might as well be scattered around you like the rubble of destruction, and it kind of gives testimony against you. So quit pretending to be so innocent.
There used to be, or sometimes there still are, these shows on where they go to people who are hoarders and they go to their homes. And these hoarders open the door and they're like, "Oh, hi, thanks for coming." And then they're kind of maneuvering their way into the center of this den of old newspaper and cardboard boxes, and they don't see them.
Right.
Because they're used to it.
Right.
But for the outsider, that's all they can see. And I get the impression it's kind of like that. They're so used to the way they've lived their lives and the choices that they've made that they like, well, if this isn't a problem, he can't see this, and they don't even see it because they're so used to doing it. But for the Creator, when he looks, it's everything that they're surrounded by is bad.
Definitely their familiarity with their transgressions is part of it, but the other part of it is their contraction of what they think God is because of their idolatry. Right? When you become an idolater and you worship idols and you think of gods as being these little statues or these forces around you that are bribed with sacrifices and really aren't everywhere. The sun god only sees you when the sun is up, that kind of thing. Then you get a very distorted conception of what deity is and what the divine is. And then it becomes very easy to think of, you can trick God the same way you can trick the police. The cop didn't see me speed, so hey, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, God's not like that. God's not like your little statue. He's not like the city watchman. God sees it and he remembers it. So don't fool yourself just because you've gotten into the habit with these idols of thinking that gods are limited, of thinking that the God is limited.
In verse 3 where it says, "With their evil they make the king glad," we can actually know which king he's talking about.
We could make a guess. So
Okay.
Hosea, like you said earlier in our discussion, spans multiple kings, both in the north and the south, and there's a little bit of discussion of where he begins and ends. But yes, he definitely was there for multiple kings. So it's hard to pin it on a particular one. But instead, what we're seeing here more as a general trend that the king is happy with what goes on. The king is party to all of the transgressions, which is exactly the opposite of what you'd expect. You normally would expect the king to be the voice of order, the voice of goodness, the voice of righteousness. That's part of his job. But the northern kings in particular, not so much. There was political reasons for them to be alienated from the worship of Adonai, at least exclusively, because they didn't have access to Jerusalem, or rather they refused to let their people have access to Jerusalem. But they also just really seem to enjoy being bad. And one of the great things about being king is if you can ignore God, then you are the top of the moral totem pole, and you can do whatever you feel like. As was famously stated by Mel Brooks, it's good to be king.
So, verse 3 there, with their evil they make the king glad, and with their lies princes. And we've discussed before how the princes are the kind of the clan leaders and the, I suppose it'd be the lords if we were going to look at it in kind of a medieval approach, the landowners and the heads of the clans and the families.
Exactly. It wasn't quite the same as dukes and earls and stuff like that, but definitely there was an upper class and a landed aristocracy that didn't inherit titles per se, but definitely inherited power and authority in the region.
And now we get on to, I think, what is the main theme running through this chapter, and it seems to be about baking.
That's the metaphor that's being used, yes.
Yeah. And I don't know of another area in the Tanakh that is so heavily... I mean, we can mention a few parts. There's when Abraham had his vision and he saw a burning oven.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the when Samson's parents, I think, had a visit by an angel, and then the guy flew into the air and it looked like he was a smouldering oven as well from the smouldering oven. But this goes on for quite a while, and
it's an extended metaphor, yes.
it is. And one which I'm not going to lie, I read through a few times before I started to get the point of what they were trying to say. So we'll take it slowly. 4. They are all adulterers, like an oven heated by the baker. The arouser rests from kneading the dough until it leavens. I'm going to tell you what I think it means, and then you can tell me if I'm right. So the baker is the human, and the oven in the metaphor later on is the area of him which kind of lusts and yearns for things.
Good so far.
Okay, and the so when it says here the oven is heated by the baker, this is a person. Let's do it again. They are all adulterers, like an oven heated by the baker. So they are fueling a battery of lust and evil intention. The arouser rests from kneading the dough until it leavens. So when you do make bread, you generally knead it, and then you leave it, and it grows and leavens itself, right? It gets bigger, and you end up with more bread because you've taken your time.
Right. And so this is really coming to some great psychology of how humans work, which is we have that period of intense driving of our passions and giving into them and inflaming them, and then there's a period where we let it build, and then we act on it, right? So first it gets inflamed, then it smolders, and then it bursts out into action, and this is partly just to say how people work, but it's also partly answering the uncertainty in verse 1 of God, of like, I'm not sure whether I should be healing you guys right now because of your contrition, because this may just be the lull in the baking cycle, right? You've stepped away from the oven, you've stepped away from actually stoking the fires, just so that you can do the kneading, in order to help puff up the dough, but it's all going to come, it's all part of the same thing. So this pause may not be actual tshuva, a returning to God. This pause may just be a lull in the normal cycle of how betrayal works.
Yeah, and he's there and he's going, look, I'm not doing anything to the bread. And then he turns around 2 hours later and it's all puffed up, and then he wants to do something to the bread.
Right. And look, I'm not using the oven right now. No, but you are preparing the bread. I mean, it's, the pause isn't really a pause.
It's making me hungry. 5. The day of our king, the princes became ill from the heat of the wine. He withdrew his hand with the scorners. Again, we're talking about a literal king and literal leaders of people. The wine, again, is something that's come up in many of the previous chapters, usually because wine leads people to make mistakes. It's a bad thing. Now, this text says he withdrew his hand with the scorners. Now, to my mind, when I read that, it felt like he was withdrawing his hand with the scorners, who were also withdrawing. But that's not what it means, is it?
Well, this is going to be one of those ones where the words, it might have been nice if we'd had a few of them on the page, or if Hosea could have sat down and explained to us the vision that he saw better. So let me give you the translation that my particular version has. Not that I'm trying to give a preferential treatment, but just to show some of the range of options here. The day they made our king sick, and officials with poison wine, he gave his hand to traitors. And there they're actually using the he as a capital H, meaning God.
Ah, okay.
Exactly. And it's like, well, that sounds very different. So all of the words are there, but what they actually mean is going to remain in a subject of debate. So one possible explanation is the day they made our king sick, and the officials with poison of wine, is kind of like saying that everybody in leadership have been overcome by this stupidity of treachery and idolatry. And therefore, God gave them over to traitors. God allowed them to be overthrown. And indeed, the history of the Northern Kingdom is one of dynasty after dynasty being overthrown by betrayal from other people. So that's one interpretation that I think works pretty well with the words, but your mileage may vary, as they say.
For they have made ready their heart like an oven with their ambush. All night their baker sleeps, and in the morning he burns like a flaming fire. I know that I had to go through this a couple of times, and I like asking the questions that people at home may be asking. So, again, the oven in this instance is a person's lust and want, right? It's not their rational thought.
Oh, very much not. And again, it's taking this metaphor. In the old days, if you were a baker, you didn't wake up in the morning at 4 o'clock in the morning and light your fire. You lit the fire the night before. And the oven was banked, but warm and heated and ready to flare up as soon as you put a little more kindling on it in the morning to bring it back into roaring life. And that's the metaphor that's being here, right? So the people are currently sleeping like the baker, but they've laid the fire. Their ambush is set. The way they're going to attack and go after these desires is all there. It's just steaming, under a thin layer of ash, ready to burst into flame in the morning when it's time to really get cooking. And that's the metaphor that's being used here.
And it's very much. I mean, we're reading this now about the actions of a group of people many years ago, but it's also quite a good description of kind of sinful thoughts, right? Like Cain and Abel and Genesis 4:7, and he's there, and God's saying, you don't have to do this, you can change your mind, but there's that fire burning in his stomach that's not going to go out. It's a good metaphor, I think, for sin in general. Okay. They are all heated like an oven, and they devour their judges. All their kings have fallen, none of them calls to me. Now, the they in this, I'm assuming, are the people of Israel, and the judges are the prophets that have gone before?
Well, not necessarily. So,
Okay.
it's the word that's being used there is shofet, which can literally mean judge. It can also mean tribal ruler, like the judges back in the time of the Book of Judges.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily mean prophet, although certainly during the time of the judges there were people who were prophets. So it's one of those Venn diagram words. So the word shofet can either mean prophet, it can either mean a regular type of judge, or it can mean a tribal ruler. And
Because this
some
is the
people
one
are
that
all
has-
some people are all three, and
Yeah.
some people are only one of those. So
This-
when it comes to interpreting this, we're going to have to sort of use our own best analysis.
So we have Sanhedrin is mentioned in the commentary on this one. They slew their Sanhedrin because they protested against them.
Right. So in that type of translation, they're definitely going for the idea that it was their, and that's I believe taken from the Rashi, is the idea that they were attacking the judges and overthrowing the good people who were trying to stop all of the iniquity that was happening here. But we can also read this as being the pattern of destruction within the Northern Kingdom, and a warning both to the people but also to the rulers, that the kings have fallen. The northern kings fell, partly because they were betrayed by other people looking for the top seat, but also because the people showed no loyalty to their earthly kings any more than they showed to their heavenly king. And so you could say, Shoftehem, their rulers, rather than their judges, with the idea being that they would attack their kings just as easily as they betrayed me, says God. So both work.
Yeah.
The people attacking those who try to give them good counsel, and the people attacking the wicked, showing that they're willing to betray everyone. It's not as though this is a people that have rejected God, but are loyal to something else. They are disloyal across the board. They are equal opportunity betrayers.
Okay. And none of them calls to me. I'm very grateful for the capital M in that. Sometimes they don't make it very obvious who's supposed to be speaking, but in this it is.
Yeah, there are no capital letters in Hebrew, unfortunately.
No, that's right. So verse 8. Ephraim mingles with the peoples. Ephraim was as a cake which was not turned over. Cake is going to confuse some people. I think it's just they're talking about kind of a flatbread, like, and this is only important because you don't turn cakes over. So I'm assuming it's kind of like a flatbread or one of those things that Abraham was supposed to have cooked up for his guests. Or
Can we just use the great American word, a pancake?
a pan? Yeah, that works. Pancake's
Right,
fine.
or even
Yeah.
pancake in the British sense. I mean, it's something that is still flipped and turned over. But this is
Sure.
probably talking about something that is thicker, but it is made more like a cake than like a bread,
Yeah.
and that's why you need to turn it over. And if you don't turn it over, it's not done.
Sure.
Right, and that's the idea. And what happens if you don't turn it over is either it doesn't get complete, or it burns on one side. So, with the idea that they are not turning, because that not turned over is either saying it's not turned or it lacks the capacity for turning. It depends on how you want to translate that into that verse.
I have read the commentary for many of the verses that we've covered so far, and the commentary will say that this is present tense. Well, it was present tense. It was happening while this was being spoken. However, for Ephraim mingles with the people, the commentary, Rashi's commentary, says he will mingle in exile with the nations. So as a reader, how do we know when they're talking about something that was contemporary to the time, and how do we know when they're talking about something in the future? Because even afterwards it said Ephraim was as a cake, not will be as a cake. Is this just because that's Rashi's opinion, or is that the actual reading of the text? And now I want you to stand up, no sitting on the fence.
Yeah.
Is Rashi right or wrong?
Right, and the answer is, of course, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So, like I think we said, we were talking about last episode, the text has to work to some degree as it was written for the audience that were hearing it. And that certainly can work. Now, the problem with whether the first half of this verse, that Ephraim is mingled among the people, the reason why that's tricky is because there's no verb there. Well, I mean, there is kind of, yit bolal, but is it saying they will be or are? Because that verbs in Hebrew are much more slippery than they are in English. You know, the tenses can play with your understanding. So this could either be saying the idea that Ephraim, the northern kingdom, has embraced and mixed with many of the idolatrous practices of the other surrounding nations. Most famously, this happened under Ahab with Jezebel, who brought in the worship of Baal. But this was common to mix with all of these other nations' idolatry all across the north and throughout its history. Or this can be talking about the fact that the northern kingdom was constantly seeking alliances with many other rather horrible nations that surrounded them for their own political or military ends. Or, like Rashi is suggesting, this can be talking about the fact that Ephraim, the northern kingdom, is going to be thoroughly destroyed by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians will implement their policy of dispersing all of the citizenry of the north amongst other nations. So this can be both chastisement to the current population of saying you guys are mixing these pagan ideas way too much into your daily life, and a warning that you will become mixed, as in a sense lost, among these other nations if you don't change your ways.
Okay.
So
and
the power of poetry is you can say more than one thing at a time.
Right. And the idea of the them being a cake is that we can take it either way. Either they weren't ready for the challenge of being who they are, and they made mistakes because they were mingled among the peoples, and they absorbed things they shouldn't have absorbed, or the idea that they burnt on the one side and they were unusable, and that could be down to the exile and things like that.
Or that they simply like this, cake. Maybe you can say it was stuck to the pan. It just wasn't. It wasn't going to be flipped. Meaning that your repentance, remember, which was the beginning theme of this chapter 7,
Sure.
is never really going to happen. You're not really going to turn. I'm still going to talk to you, and I still want to hope and give you the warnings, but it's not looking good. Something's burning in the kitchen, and I think it's your side.
Okay. Strangers have consumed his strength, but he did not know. Also, weakness was cast into him, but he did not know. And this is down again to the fact that Ephraim was mingling with other nations, because we have to, when it's talking about mingling with the peoples here, the peoples means other nations. It's
right,
not,
and making alliances with other nations, thinking that was the source of their salvation. And that was, I believe, back in chapter 5 or 6 as well. We talked about that notion that they were, looking for help from every source other than God. And that's partly what's happening here. And they don't even notice that all of their alliances and the tribute they're giving to these other nations and their dealings, it's eating them up. It's taking their wealth, their prosperity, but it's also taking their spirit. And they don't even seem to know.
It feels like they're offering them protection money.
Well, I mean, that's what tribute was. It's a protection racket among nations.
And the pride of Israel was humbled before him, and they did not return to the Lord their God. They did not seek him despite this. They realized that nothing was working, and they saw that they were fallen and broken. And even then, they didn't think, the thing to do here would be to return to our God.
No. Instead, we get what they did do, which is verse 11.
And Ephraim was like a silly dove without a heart, and they called upon Egypt. They went to Assyria. Do you have silly dove in yours?
I do indeed.
Oh, wow, okay.
Okay, which, I mean, again, you have to go, what does it mean by it didn't have a heart? If we're not talking necessarily that they were cruel. Not having a heart in biblical poetry means you had no sense. Right? You had no common sense even, let alone advanced rational capacity. And you have to think of doves the way we might think of homing pigeons, right? Doves and pigeons, they know their home, they know their roost, and they come back night after night. That's why we use them for homing races and whatnot. And they were very commonly used. And here you have an image of a dove that doesn't know which way to go. It doesn't know where home is. It's just going this way, it's going that way, it's going to Egypt, it's going to Assyria. And they're missing where home is. Home being, of course, God, and that is where they should be pointed. But instead, they're just flitting this way and that way.
You see, that's why you are invaluable. Invaluable. That's brilliant. They completely coloured in that for me, and thank you very much. Now I don't mind silly doves as much. That's they're good.
I mean, silly. I know silly is a tricky word in English. So I'm trying to think of another good synonym for silly.
Maybe confused,
foolish,
disorientated, foolish. Yeah,
foolish, or senseless. I mean, it's really like without bearing, without direction. But of course, the aftermath of what being a silly dove brings is what 12 is then going to have.
When they go, I will spread my net over them. Like the fowl of the heaven, I will bring them down. I will chastise them as I let their congregation hear. So we have this concept then that when they do kind of realize where they want to go, wherever that is, there's this line here, like the fowl of the heaven, I will bring them down. So they're being hunted?
Exactly. You think a homeless dove, one that doesn't find its roost, is going to be picked up by the fowler's net, by the guy who's out hunting pigeons and doves. And if you're not at home, you're going to end up in someone's dinner. And in this particular case, the dinner that you're going to be in is the dinner of these great empires that surround you.
And I will chastise them as I let their congregation hear. Are we talking then about the punishment that's going to come to these people? It's going to be kind of very public?
That's the way to understand it, most likely, yes. It's a very tricky phrase, to be honest. Just to give you the range that you could also translate it as, the version that I have says, when they go, I will spread my net over them. I will bring them down like the birds of the sky. They rearrange the word orders to make it a little bit more pleasant in English. But that second phrase, I will chastise them when I hear their bargaining.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's a totally different way of rendering whether or not that last word means bargaining or whether it means their congregation. And both work. And either it's the idea that they're going to be brought down in front of everybody, or they're going to be brought down as I hear them doing all these negotiations and schemes trying to secure their position with these other nations. So it really both fit the metaphor just fine.
And it just goes to show, if you're reading along at home and you can't read the Hebrew to a degree that you understand it without any help, having more than one translation can really help fill out the gaps.
Or at least show you where the gaps are going to stay, just because the words can mean more than one thing.
Woe is to them, for they have wandered away from me. Plunder to them, for they have rebelled against me. I would redeem them, but they spoke lies about me. You don't often find... Plunder is normally a thing, not an action. And I think that's the first time I've ever read plunder to them, like, let them be plundered, for they have rebelled against me. I would redeem them, but they spoke lies about me. I kind of get where most of that's coming from, but the lies that they spoke, do we have any inkling? Is it just literally because they were supposed to be the people of God and they didn't live that way, and they're kind of witnessing?
Right. Well, the word isn't actually lies. I mean, in this particular case, I like the translation that I have here a little better, which renders the last word kizavim as being they plotted treasonously against me.
Ah, okay.
Right, so that they spoke like treasoners against me. I think maybe a little bit because the word for lie is sheker usually is not here in this verse, but and it carries on that theme that Hosea has throughout his entire book of betrayal, of treason, of the imagery of adultery as being the primary metaphor.
And they did not cry out to me with the heart, therefore they will wail in their beds. Because of the corn and the wine which they store up, they turn away from me. And we spoke about this in the last show where we covered many portions of the prophets with the Haftarah series we did, and how it was the Northern Kingdom, especially physical wealth and security, that led them to not feel they needed to be a part of, to have that relationship with their Creator anymore, or at least not in the way that they were supposed to. And so they're not reaching out to their Creator, and so He's going to make sure that they feel the pain that they've inflicted on themselves.
He's going to let them feel that. I mean, that's the thing, is that in this verse, they are already beginning to feel the effects, but they're not turning to God, or at least not turning to God sincerely, right? Bilibam, in their heart, in their real emotion and thought, God is not their answer. They are still looking to their wealth. They're still looking to their allies, thinking there's some way to bargain their way out of this. And no, the way out of this is to stop being horrible people. But that's hard.
That'd be a great T-shirt. Life could be better for you if you stopped being horrible people. You can find that on my website next week for $18.
There was a one of those demotional posters I saw once that said, you know what I'm talking about, the ones that are like demotivational, that they take the things you see in corporate offices that are always so trite, and they flip them on their head. And there was a great one that said, the common element in all your failed relationships is you.
There's a Charlie Brown thing I remember. Charlie Brown sitting there and he's looking up at an aeroplane, and he says to Lucy, I wish I was on that aeroplane going somewhere. And she says, you'd still be you, Charlie Brown.
Yeah, pretty much. That sounds like one of the early ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was. The early Charlie Browns were really quite harsh.
Yeah, dark. Verse 15. But I chastised them, I strengthened their arms. Yet to me they attribute evil. So I get the chastised part. I strengthened their arms. Is that meant in a similar way to when the Creator strengthens Pharaoh's heart? Or we read it as heartened, but it kind of means it gave, it made Pharaoh more sure of his position when Israel wanted to leave and go into the desert.
So I'm not exactly sure. That's certainly possible. But in this particular case, I think that the sort of Rashi idea I like a little better, which is the idea that God tried to help them. Right? He gave them chastisement, and He gave them strength through the prophets. Which is what Hosea himself is doing in this verse. And yet they still went ahead and were betraying God. They plotted against God and were evil toward God. So it's like, it's not as though I've just left you unattended. I've been trying to give you chastisement, and chastisement is meant to be a good thing, right? It is the good parent who points out the child's mistakes in order to help them learn. It's the bad parent who just ignores what the child is doing. And what he's doing is like, I've given you strength, I've given you instruction, you've had everything you need to do a good thing, and yet look what you still do.
All right, yep. That makes sense. It's that sandwich. I was told when I went to teacher training, they said if you have to give criticism, always do it in the form of a sandwich or a cake. So you tell them something bad, something good, something bad, or something bad and then something good. But there has to be a little sweetness on top. And I like the way it starts off with the chastisement, and then it says, I strengthened their arms. So there was that positive inclination too. Right, so we're on to the last line again. Verse 16. They will return, but to no avail. They were like a deceitful bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword from the fury of their tongue. This is their derision in the land of Egypt. I tell you, more than 2 lines, and my tongue gets crazy tight. The bow pit kind of makes sense. A deceitful bow, I assume, is one where you line up your shot and you let go of the arrow and it goes somewhere completely different. But I suppose one of the most important parts is the first kind of line, they will return, but to no avail. So there's this understanding that there will be a return, not to the Creator, but to one of the places that they're looking for help, to I think the two places that I mentioned, Egypt and was it Assyria?
Exactly right. So, and this particular verse, it seems to be applying more to the Egyptian attempt to get Egypt on their side. So when it says return, we're really talking about, it's like, as was prohibited over and over again in the Torah, you don't go back to Egypt. And here they're going back to Egypt, and they're like a deceitful bow. They're pointed in the wrong direction, right? They're supposed to be aiming true, and they're aiming the wrong way, and their words are going to bring them down. So all of their treaties and their entreaties and all of their bargaining and deals, they will die, because everything they have done has completely avoided the real issue, which is their problems, their transgressions, their sins. And they'll go on talking down in Egypt, but this is not what's going to save them.
And to find out what will save them, tune in next time, where we go and we bounce on to chapter 8. Right, so if you have questions at home that you would like answered about anything we've covered so far, or some future question in this book, please let us know in the comment section. And if you like this video, please tell your friends, give it a thumbs up on YouTube, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much, Rabbi Neely, for giving us your time again.
Thank you, Jason.
If you would like to hear more of Rabbi Neely's lectures and programs and classes, there'll be a link on your screen right now. You can go over to his YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button. He does weekly Torah classes and Mishnah. Thank you very much. It's totally choking on Midrash. And if you want to know the difference between Mishnah and Midrash, we have videos on that too. So you can go and look those up too, which is there'll be a link on links everywhere. Actually, if you hang around to the end of the video, there'll be at least 4 decent other videos that you're going to want to go and see now. And we'll see you all again next week.